century. So the world is in a phase of major readjustment. The international order also faces huge challenges. At the same time, we are also happy to see that the trend toward a multipolar world remains unchanged. Economic globalization manifests new vitality. To safeguard multilateralism and to strengthen communication has been the calling of the day. Our era is both one of challenges and one of great hopes. In face of global challenges, all countries are connected in a community of mankind of shared future. In the post-pandemic era, how do we safeguard the shared interest of humanity, avoid splitting up, shore up cooperation, and uphold the UN-centered international system and the international law-centered international order and the international relations principles anchored in the Charter of the UN, and move international relations in the direction of multilateralism and safeguard real and true multilateralism. These are issues people of vision have been reflecting on. As I said, we are joined by 3 keynote speakers. Let me introduce them. Our first speaker is former Japanese Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo. He was Prime Minister between 2007 and 2008. He was the 91st Prime Minister of Japan. Before that, he also held key positions in the Japanese cabinet. Prime Minister Fukuda, during his prime ministership, contributed tremendously to Japan-China cooperation and a steady relationship between our 2 countries. Well, afterwards, he has consistently worked for friendly exchanges and relationship with China. Next, please welcome Mr. Fukuda. He will speak on the international order. Please welcome. Good morning. On the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the CPC's founding, I'm very glad to offer my congratulations. Today, I'm going to talk about China, US, and Japan's roles. These are my personal opinions. In the 21st century, China has achieved unprecedentedly fast development in the world. Besides fast economic development, China has a population 3.5 times of the US population and 12 times the Japanese population. The Chinese economy is already 3.5 times the economy, and in a few years, probably the Chinese economy will be as large as the United States, which has been the largest since World War II. This is astonishing achievement. There are concerns and anxiety in the world of China's success. This is no surprise. If there is difference between China and the United States, 2 important countries in the world, then this would mean huge for Japan, which is already facing a turning point or at a juncture. So Japan has to work to prevent the differences turning into more serious ones between China and the United States. Even when there is no war, we have to put a stop to the unintentional competition. there was a time when countries competed for the number of nuclear warheads, and the consequences were collapse of their economic systems, and they had to sign agreement to end the competition. And the agreement I referred to was the Reykjavik Agreement. Today we are facing more serious and urgent issues facing the entire humanity. For instance, climate change. We have an international consensus on the importance of these issues. To overcome these difficulties, China, the US, and Japan must work together and use our wisdom. The US has always been on high guard against China's catching up, especially after the outbreak of the pandemic. The US has been very suspicious of China, but the US cannot prevent China's growth, because such attempt would damage economic and social development and would also cost the United States the trust the world has in it. President Biden has said some tough words on China. To say these remarks are based on long-term considerations is not as accurate as to say they are a makeshift measure. In a few years, the US will be replaced by China as the largest economy in the world, but even when that happens, the US will remain the leader of the democracies. So it is not necessary for the US to do anything economically or socially. The US has been thinking of its global power image that upholds world peace and security. We hope the US will continue this image. China enjoys sustained economic growth, and the Chinese people are confident and happy, and they have the dream of their country being a great global power, and they have high expectations on their leader, President Xi Jinping. Some people call Chinese system authoritarian, but actually this system has the Chinese people's support. And this system is changing because of things like smartphones. So in this regard, this is completely consistent with us democracies. And sometimes, however, too much nationalism would be counterproductive. So with regard to the Chinese system, the so-called democracies cannot just criticize. You have to demonstrate what are your strengths. In the coming years, China will continue its growth, and now China is able to achieve its growth. It is in large part due to the global economic system the United States helped to build and maintain. So this is something we cannot overlook. So I hope we will be able to understand each other. This is a community of shared future. Successful China cannot just push aside the economic issues it faces. If the world can no longer exist, how can we develop? This is what a community of shared future is about. Because of global warming, the permanent frozen soil in Siberia is melting, and the CO2 emission is leading to explosive rise in temperature. The deforestation in the north and the south has led to the release of carbon dioxide from deep ground. This has been happening since last century. So we have to realize the era where development is everything is coming to an end. The international community faces a task where we must unite in order to tackle it, and we must act with urgency. Global powers must be exemplary. They must not fight among themselves. Well, then what should Japan do? First, to the United States, Japan should use its alliance with the United States to work on climate change. We must find the right direction. And with regard to China, China is our close neighbor. It was, is, and will be closely linked with Japan. So we must step up our cooperation with China. Only when we have the understanding of U.S. and China can Japan-U.S. relations be successful. Of course, the Koreans must also join us. We must transit from confrontation to cooperation. So trust among countries, especially their leaders, is the key, because leaders must talk to each other, especially on these important issues. Then, can we establish trust amongst all the leaders in the world? We must find better ways to achieve this.
We need the leaders to focus on the long-term goal and make responsible efforts. That is all for my speech. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Former Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo. He made a number of points from the perspective of China, the United States, and Japan, and he shared views on international order. I will save the time by leaving more time for later interactions with the audience. So I will not make any comments on the presentation anymore. And if you get the opportunity to ask questions, you can directly ask questions or make comments on Mr. Fukuda Yasuo's presentation. Anyone? I have a question for you. I'm Wu Xinbo from Fudan University. Just now you said that Japan should play a constructive and positive role between China and the United States to promote trilateral cooperation. But we feel that now actually Japan is actually promoting confrontation between China and the United States. And what is your comment on Japan's effort now? Thank you. Yes, indeed. A lot of things have happened, and some of them are not positive. I think that is really dangerous. Japan has a 70 or 80-year alliance with the United States. That has a big influence on Japan. But we also need to think about our relations with China. Our relationship with China is younger than our relationship with the United States, but it is still very important, especially considering China's development, which is closely related to Japan. And China's development also has a big impact on Japan. The development of China and Japan has been benefiting from China-Japan cooperation. And now the impact of China and Japan on each other is bigger than ever. So we need to pay more attention to cooperation. I believe there should be cooperation between the three countries, not confrontation. Although we have seen some bad things happen, but we hope that we will not be too much influenced by those bad things, and we need to work in the long term for the general big goal. Thank you. Any more comments or questions? Thank you, Mr. Fukuda Yasuo, and I also want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. When you were the Prime Minister and even after leaving office, you have been working very hard for China-Japan relations, and you have also given a lot of support to the forum. I'm Liu Jiangru from the Department of International Relations of Tsinghua University. I have this question. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the normalization of relations between China and Japan. My question is this. As a former Prime Minister of Japan or a common Japanese citizen now, what do you think China and Japan should do to forge a better relationship between the two sides in the coming 5 decades in order to make more contributions to world peace and development? Thank you. Yes. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the relations between China and Japan. We want to celebrate that important milestone. Japan also attaches great importance to the year. How should lead our relationship to a better future? I think the most important thing is to enable the young people to better appreciate the significance of the bilateral relationship and forge a good foundation for the exchanges between the young people. I think there are some good things happening along this line. For example, in recent years, a lot of Chinese tourists visited Japan. Through such tours, they have developed a better understanding of Japan, and I think that is a good foundation for our mutual understanding. I hope that COVID-19 will be ended soon so that our people-to-people contacts will be restored as soon as possible. I'm very pleased that I used to visit China frequently, but in recent years, I have not been able to do that. That is really a deep regret to me. I also want to come back to China to see the progress and changes that are taking place in China now, and to have more opportunities to maintain exchanges with you. That is very important. But because of COVID-19, our exchanges have been obstructed to some extent. But today we have this online exchange. I do hope that under any circumstances, we will maintain our communication to deepen our understanding of each other. I know that this is a special moment. It will not be always there. I hope that we will try our best to continue to promote our friendship and grow our relationship. I believe in a better relationship between our two sides. Thank you very much for your question, and thank you for the response. The friend in white shirt. Mr. Yasuo, I'm from Caijing, a journalist from the magazine. We know that there will be the Tokyo Olympic Games in 2021, which will happen soon, but we see the new variety, the Delta COVID-19. But Japan is still going to hold the Olympic Games as planned. And it is very firm in this decision. So as a political leader of Japan, what is your comment? What does the Olympic Games mean to Japan, internationally or nationally? Thank you. The Olympic Games significance is well known by all. The Olympic Games will boost friendship across the whole world. But now we are in a severe situation. It is not a matter of Japan alone. But under such circumstances, that also means that we need to work harder to create a better atmosphere of friendship for the whole world. Now the COVID-19 has been developing faster, and it is not easy to end it soon. And in Tokyo, it is also rising in terms of COVID-19, but it is Tokyo's decision about whether they will host the games as planned. But whether the government or the people, they will make great efforts to ensure that the Olympic Games will go smoothly. But if because of the Olympic Games, the COVID-19 is spreading even faster, that will bring more burdens to all of us. We need to ensure that we will prevent that from happening. So we are doing everything to try to prevent them from happening, and we want to avoid the further spread of the COVID-19. We hope that we need to be more strict in carrying out different measures to ensure the smooth operation of the games. Thank you for your question, and thank you for the response. Because time is limited, I think we will have to end the interactions for the first speaker. And Mr. Fukuda Yasuo has given comprehensive and deep-going responses. So that is all for this part. We want to thank Mr. Fukuda Yasuo for sharing his perspectives on the world order and for addressing the questions raised from the audience. And now I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the United Nations. From 2007 to 2016, for 2 terms actually. He was the first UN Secretary General from East Asia. As Secretary General of the UN, he was committed to global poverty reduction, sustainable development, climate change response, protecting human rights and women's interests and rights. And he has done a lot of efforts to promote global sustainable development. As Secretary General of the United Nations for 2 terms, we believe Mr. Ban Ki-moon has special ideas about the evolving international situation and the world order. So now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It's my great honor and privilege to speak to you today at the 9th World Peace Forum. I express my sincere thanks to President Chi Yong, President of Tsinghua University, and also Dr. Wang Chu, President of Chinese People's Institution of Foreign Affairs. And I also thank former Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda, who just made a very important statement. Ladies and gentlemen, today we find ourselves at the center of a variety of converging global crises and increased uncertainty, and that have made it necessary to reassess the international order. The COVID-19 pandemic and climate change are just the two most serious challenges our humanity and planets are now facing. On top of these crises, both the great power rivalries and tensions, regional conflicts are growing, hampering key geopolitical cooperation when it is needed the most. Meanwhile, cyber attacks are surging in scope and severity and threatening not only international security, but also energy and food security for ordinary people. Under this backdrop, I firmly believe that we must elevate our sustained efforts to reinvigorate multilateral cooperation in order to holistically address the inherently global challenges of both today and tomorrow. No country is an island in today's increasingly interconnected world. Isolationism is simply no match for viruses, wildfires, cyber attacks, sea level rise, or other non-traditional security threats. As such, I'd like to propose the following three areas where we have to work together. First, we need to ensure equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and go further in the fight against vaccine inequity. Thankfully, a variety of safe and effective vaccines are beginning to be distributed after more than 180 million COVID-19 cases and now approaching 4 million tragic deaths globally. But at the moment, only about 20% of the global population, mostly those in wealthy countries, have received one jab of COVID-19 vaccines. That is why global leaders have a moral and humanitarian obligation to rectify the current situation of gross vaccine inequity and urgently come together in solidarity to vaccinate the world. We must remember, no one is safe until everybody is safe. In this regard, I'm encouraged that G7 nations recently pledged to donate 1 billion vaccine doses by the end of next year. But with around 10 billion shots necessary to vaccinate the world, I think they must do much more. And I'm urging G20 nations, including China, to go even further with pledges for the developing world ahead of the Rome summit of G20 in October. And commitment must be transformed from pledges into concrete results and action represented by shots in the humanity's arms. With this in mind, I call on all nations to enhance their support for the COVAX mechanism. It is a guiding mission to get vaccines to those in need. I take this opportunity to commend China's robust commitment to ensuring that as COVID-19 vaccines become global public goods, as exemplified by its recent donation of 10 million Sinopharm vaccines to COVAX. I also urge pharmaceutical companies and other key partners in the private sector all around the world to significantly ramp up vaccine production and do everything they can to vaccinate all of humanity. Second, as we strive to vaccinate the world, the leaders must also elevate their actions to harness the transformational blueprint of the United Nations global goals to build peace and security and ensure sustainable development. This will help bring us closer together, build back better from COVID-19, and revitalize multilateral cooperation when it is now needed more than ever before. Doing so also tackle hunger and poverty, boost sustainable growth, fortify public health, and advance climate action, scale up education, and much more. During my time as UN Secretary General, I am incredibly proud to have brought the entire world together to agree to the UN Sustainable Development Goals with 17 goals. Nearly 6 years since SDGs adoption, the SDGs have made tangible progress on tackling maternal mortality rates, combating poverty and hunger, and improving the quality of water and sanitation. But progress is uneven on others, with some sectors and geographic areas moving faster than others. And COVID-19 conflicts and climate change are all leading to troubling reversals in SDG implementation on the ground. With this in mind, global partnership is absolutely necessary if we are to deliver on our development commitment. That is SDG goal number 17 highlights prominent role that the private sector alongside the government, civil society, academia, and others should play to help achieve the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, number 3, considering the long-term habitability of our planet and existential fate of humanity is at stake, we simply must come together to raise our urgency and ambition in addressing the rapidly worsening climate crisis. Climate change is fueling insecurity, conflict, refugee flows, and public health perils around the world. Species are at risk of extinction, and ecosystems are collapsing. As a result of climate change, rising sea levels are an existential threat to many small island developing states, as well as some of the world's most populous and economically important cities around the world. For example, in recent weeks, much of the northern hemisphere has been suffering through an exceptional heat wave, with the temperatures in the Siberian town of Verkhoyansk in the Arctic Circle even soaring to 48 degrees Celsius on June 21st. The difference, Verkhoyansk is known as the coldest spot in the world, -60s normally. Then plus 48 degrees Celsius, that means there is a difference of 100 degrees. For warming is not just a future threat. A landmark study released last month in the scientific journal Nature says that nearly 37% of all global heat-related death can now be blamed on human-caused climate change. To mitigate these threats, we must expediently step up our collective efforts to cut global emissions and implement the Paris Climate Change Agreement. To faithfully implement the Paris Agreement and push it further, countries need to expand their ambitions and urgency to cut emissions. And we must secure increased climate financing from upper-income nations and through the catalyzing power of cooperation and global partnership. This is particularly critical in the lead-up to this year's COP26 in Glasgow, United Kingdom, where the climate rulebook will be finalized. In this regard, I highly commend China and other nations for their commitment to reach net zero emission. Now, global leaders must go further by expanding climate funding for developing nations and scale up financing for climate adaptation to ensure that COP26 is a great success. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here today to reassess the international order, it is clear that we cannot return to the way things were prior to the pandemic. Indeed, we must build back better and greener by constructing healthier societies for all peoples and our planet. At the same time, our multilateral recovery from this pandemic and its secondary impact must also address climate change and inequality to steer us to a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient future. This is especially important in this era of growing uncertainty, great power, rivalry, and rapid change. The strong cooperation and leadership of China and the United States were integral to realization of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, securing those 195 signatures in December 2015. And I do hope that the spirit of this paradigm-shifting example of Sino-American cooperation can also be replicated to address other significant global health, climate, and security challenges today. In our increasingly interconnected world, global challenges can only be solved by global responses. We should recall what President Xi Jinping has said. I quote, "We live in a shared world and face a shared destiny," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, let us use the UN global goals as a guidepost and come together in multilateral cooperation to illuminate a brighter post-pandemic international order for all of us. We have a moral and political responsibility to make sure that our succeeding generations, our humanity, and planet Earth live sustainable and prosperous. Thank you very much. 谢谢。
感谢潘基文先生的
Thank you, Mr. Pan Ki-moon, for your keynote speech. Mr. Pan offered his perspective as former UN Secretary General of the world's issues. Next, I would like to open the floor for questions. This friend holding a notebook. Thank you, President Wang, for giving me this opportunity to ask. Mr. Pan, your speech was very inspirational. You were UN Secretary General, so I believe your perspective is very unique because you were responsible for the entire humanity. And I can still feel that responsibility. This session focuses on the international order, and you spoke of your thoughts, including what you did for sustainability as UN Secretary General. We know today the world faces very severe challenges like the pandemic. So we feel a sense of urgency and a crisis like never before. Multilateralism is facing challenges like never before. The West, led by the United States, was very much unilateral during President Trump. Now with President Biden, they are returning to multilateralism, but the kind of multilateralism they are returning is a narrow multilateralism, not the broad one we hope for. Because when they say a rules-based multilateralism is different from the kind of UN-centered multilateralism we see. So my question is, as a former UN Secretary General, how do you see the content of multilateralism? This is my first question. A second is a more specific question. You spoke of the upcoming G20 summit. I very much agree with your remarks about the G20 and its role. I believe the G20 should reflect, should be seen and function as a platform of multilateralism as opposed to the narrow and pseudo multilateralism the West has been speaking of. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. This is a very important one. As you said, that during President Trump's era, as a former Secretary General, I was really angry and frustrated by the way that United States, the leading country in this world, together with China, then has withdrawn from a major international multilateral agreement, starting from Paris Climate Change Agreement, and also they withdrew from the WHO at the peak of such a crisis when all the countries were suffering from COVID-19. Then they also withdrew from JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on controlling this nuclear issue of Iran, where China was one of the very important parties of signature as P5. Those were really shaking the whole world in disarray. So multilateralism was a disarray. With the advent of President Biden's era in the United States, I am much more encouraged by his decision to return to climate change agreement, and there is a very serious negotiation to rejoin the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Nuclear Issues on Iran, and also there is much more cooperative atmosphere in this world. So this kind of mutually cooperative relationship must continue to solve all the problems of current multilateral problems. As I said in my statement, no country is an island, and there is no country, however powerful, however resourceful one may be, like the United States or China. You cannot solve this alone. You cannot solve this alone. We have to put all our hands on the deck together. We have to put all our resources and strength to fight back the climate change better, and also to fight back these viruses. This is very important issues where whole world's political leaders must work together. And in this regard, I also ask business leaders, business communities, they should also provide all their resources and science and technologies to address climate change issues and COVID-19 issues and many other issues. Now, I think that's my strong message. And China can also be a very important player in this. Thank you.
好，请这位先生回答吧。刚才已经举过一次手了。哎，
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for your wonderful presentation. I'm from Shanghai Tongji University. I'm Xia Liping. I'm a professor. Mr. Ban Ki-moon When you were Secretary General of the United Nations and after you left the office, you have been devoting a lot of efforts to the peace and development and international cooperation. We appreciate your contribution. Thank you for everything you have been doing. My question is this. Now the world is facing a lot of severe challenges and the international situation is getting more and more complex. And there is more and more major country competition. Against this backdrop, the United Nations is the most important international organization. What can the United Nations do to promote the development of true multilateralism and to prevent any negative multilateralism? For example, a small number of countries are actually developing small groups to oppress other countries or suppress other countries. Thank you.
This is also very important questions. Of course, United Nations is the backbone and symbol and represent the whole international community. We have three major pillars. That is, one is peace and security. Just to protect the succeeding generation from scourge of war, which we have experienced during World War I and World War II. So we should never repeat this kind of a tragic global wars. Then second important is development, sustainable development. We have presented SDGs, where China has been playing a very important role. If we implement all these 17 goals, I think the world will be much better. By 2030, there should be nobody who should suffer from abject poverty. There should be nobody in this world who should die unnecessarily from preventable diseases. And there should be nobody by 2030 then who should be treated unequally. In that regard, I'd like to highly commend China's role during the time of Millennium Development Goals. The number one goal of MDG and number one goal of SDG is to lift the people living in abject poverty, hunger. China has made a strong push by lifting more than 400 million people out of poverty by 2010, and made the World Bank was able to proudly announce that number one goal of Millennium Development Goals was already achieved 5 years before. Then can we implement all these 17 goals by 2030? I think we have to do much better, much more, particularly to help these all small developing countries, as you said. China has been providing very generous support to these developing countries through Belt and Road Initiative, and also, very importantly, China-Africa Forum. You have provided more than $60 billion for 3 years to African development. This is what United Nations really hope that other countries, other rich countries should do, like the G7 countries. G7 countries are obligated to mobilize $100 billion and provide every year $100 billion from this year to these all vulnerable countries so that they can address climate change issues. But have we done enough? Of course, the recent G7 summit has made the commitment, but the commitment should come with the detailed roadmap. Therefore, I hope when President Xi Jinping participated in the G20 summit this year, I think this should be discussed seriously. Of course, G20 is not all rich countries, but China as a G20 members and also G2 country, and you have also moral and political responsibility. In that regard, I really hope that Chinese will play a more active role in leading this forum. And in this regard, I believe that all this kind of political rivalries between the United States and China, this is totally unnecessary at this time, and we have to pool all our resources, time and strength, political will in addressing global challenges for our succeeding generation. Many people, 4 million people have died from this COVID-19. These are preventable diseases. We have to work very hard, and I really count on China's continued leadership. Thank you.
好，谢谢。最后一个问题，因为时间关系，请。
Okay, last question. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm from CAS. I'm from the World Social and Political Studies Department. And our topic today is to uphold and practice multilateralism. But the world has no consensus on what is multilateralism. Different countries have different ideas. Because you used to be Secretary General of the United Nations, what is multilateralism in the true sense, in your heart? What the United Nations to do to help the international community to build consensus on what is multilateralism? Thank you very much.
In two short way, first of all, the member state of the United Nations, 193, they should fully abide by the Charter provision of the United Nations. Big and small. There are big countries and small countries, but there is no difference between the size of countries. They are all equal. The second most important thing is that there should be a global partnership. This is number 17 goal, SDGs. However ambitious, however good plans you may have, you cannot handle all these global issues at this time without mobilizing, without strengthening a global partnership. So global partnership is a very important tools in addressing and solidifying and strengthening the multilateralism. So this is a very important tool. Without global partnership, you cannot do anything. And then the most important issue that member states must be adhere and strictly adhere to the basic principles of United Nations Charter. And it's a peace and security for all, and also sustainable development. All this prosperity should be shared so that all big and small, rich and poor countries can live harmoniously as a human being. And all these human rights should be fully protected by all this. Whatever you may be, whether man and women, whether you are having some sexually different orientations, whether you are coming from big countries or small countries, there are many ways to discriminate people, but all this should be abolished, so all human rights should be upheld. That is a very important principles to make multilateralism work together at this time. Thank you.
非常感谢潘基文先生的回答。那么刚才确实有很多朋友都。
Thank you, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for your wonderful response. And we can see still a lot of people raising their hands to ask questions, but because of time, we will have to stop here. Thank you very much, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for your sharing and for your interactions with the audience. And now I'd like to.
好，谢谢。下面我们请出第3位。
Well, next I would like to invite our third keynote speaker, Mr. Kevin Rudd. Mr. Kevin Rudd is currently President of Asia Society of the United States. He was Australia's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. He has keen insights and experience on international and regional issues. He is a profound thinker and a scholar. Mr. Kevin Rudd is also a well-known China hand. For many times he visited China and he actually attended World Peace Forum for many times. He is also an old friend of China. Since I'm representing the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs, I'd like to say he is also an old friend of my institution. So I'm very thankful for Mr. Kevin Rudd for having already attended the opening ceremony and is again with us for this session. Now, Mr. Kevin Rudd, please. Please welcome. Thank you, Mr. Wang Chao.
清华大
I seem to have a little technical issue. Okay. The World Peace Forum organized by Tsinghua University is well known in the world. So I feel honored and privileged to speak to you. But I'm going to shift back to English.
So thank you again, President Wang Chao, for your kind introduction. And to my friends at the World Peace Forum, including my old friend and colleague Yan Shike. And it's good to have heard the remarks before from Wang Yi, China's State Councillor and Foreign Minister. The important theme of this forum, of course, is upholding world peace. This is increasingly complex. The theme of this plenary session is reassessing the international order in the light of this goal of upholding world peace. Of course, today there is an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed when it comes to the changing international order and the preservation of peace in the world. And the elephant in the room is the US-China relationship. I've spoken in the past of how we are now entering into a decade of living dangerously. Fundamentally, that is because the US-China relationship is now strategically adrift. After nearly 4 decades in which that relationship was characterized by strategic engagement, we now have an undisciplined strategic competition, which has now become the norm. Moreover, both countries, in my view, believe that this decade will be make or break for their status as the future leading global power. And they fear, therefore, that this could become a zero-sum moment or decade for them. No new strategic framework between the two countries has yet been established to guide the relationship through this time of trouble. Therefore, no matter what tactics or stratagems the two sides pursue, or what events may unfold, the tension between the United States and China will grow and competition will intensify. That is inevitable. However, as I've written before, that does not mean that war is inevitable. In fact, quite the reverse. The deeply conflicting nature of US and China's strategic objectives and the profoundly competitive nature of the relationship between them may make conflict and even war seem inevitable, even if neither country wants that outcome. It is important to consider once again the argument of Harvard scholar Graham Allison and Thucydides' trap.
that rising and established powers are destined to engage in dangerous rivalry and even conflict. But it is easy to predict war. It is much harder to outline a course that could help both countries safeguard the peace. In my view, there is nothing inevitable about war. To believe that denies the agency of political leadership and makes us all captive to some deep, irreversible trends of history. And as President Xi Jinping himself has said, and I quote him, "We must not create such traps for ourselves," unquote. War under such circumstances may be a growing danger, but it is by no means inevitable. History should be our guide, but never our master. Speaking as someone who is neither from the United States nor from China, but has lived and studied both countries deeply, and has a deep respect and fondness for both countries' peoples, their history and their culture, I can certainly say that the world at large has no desire to see them come to war, whether it's a hot war or even a cold war. Certainly the rest of the world, and not just Asia, would welcome a future where they are not forced to choose to make the ultimate binary choice between Beijing and Washington in what they fear is becoming an increasingly bipolar world. They would instead prefer a world in which there continues to be a global order, in which each country, large and small, can have confidence in its future territorial integrity, its future political sovereignty, and its own pathway to national prosperity, as well as an international system with the capacity to act on the great global challenges of our time, like climate change, which no individual nation can solve alone. And that too depends on what happens next between China and the United States. Therefore, there is no other realistic alternative. A new strategic framework to manage US-China relations must be found. I also have a deeply realist view of the difficulties that now lie ahead in forging a common strategic future between these two countries. Whatever strategic trust that may have once existed in the relationship is now gone. And the reasons for this are not personal, they're not whimsical, they're not ephemeral, they are structural. And I am not so naive as to believe that any agreed strategic framework will prevent China and the US from strategizing against each other and deploying their statecraft and assets as best they can in the hope of either maintaining or securing long-term primacy. But if the United States and the Soviet Union, following the near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis, could eventually agree on a political and strategic framework to manage their own fraught relationship without triggering mutual annihilation, surely it is possible to do the same between America and China in the infinitely less trying geopolitical circumstances of today. This is where the idea of managed strategic competition emerges. I've described managed strategic competition elsewhere in the past, and I know that many of you are already familiar with it. But in review, the idea is relatively simple: to establish a new minimum strategic framework of US-China relations based on three core propositions. First, to establish a clear understanding of each other's irreducible strategic red lines. This to help prevent conflict through miscalculation or design by creating an environment in which each side concludes that clear strategic predictability advantages both, that strategic deception is futile, and that strategic surprise is just plain dangerous. Second, to then relocate the primary burden of strategic rivalry to a competitive race, in which each country would strive to its utmost for superiority, but would remain at peace for the duration of the race. Such strategic competition would also prioritize each side's political, economic, and ideological appeal to the rest of the world. And third, to create the political space necessary for China and the United States to continue to engage in strategic cooperation in a number of defined areas, where each side agrees that both their agreed global interests and their national interests would be enhanced by global collaboration, and indeed undermined by the absence of an agreed collaborative approach, such as, again, on climate change. The idea of managed strategic competition is anchored in a deeply realist view of the global order. It accepts that states will continue to seek security by building a balance of power in their favour, while recognising that in doing so they are likely to create security dilemmas for other states, whose fundamental interests may be disadvantaged by these actions. It is important to be realistic, of course, about what can be achieved through any such joint strategic framework. It will not of itself prevent war, but properly constructed and based on clarity, transparency and credible deterrence, it may reduce the risk of it. The challenge in this case is to reduce the risk to both sides as the competition between them unfolds by jointly crafting a number of limited rules of the road that help prevent war. The rules will still enable each side to compete vigorously across all policy and regional domains. If both sides could agree on those stipulations, each would have to accept that the other will still try to maximise its advantage while stopping short of breaching the limits, or the commonly agreed strategic guardrails of the relationship. Washington and Beijing would continue to compete for strategic and economic influence across the various regions of the world. They would keep seeking reciprocal access to each other's markets and would take retaliatory measures when such access was denied. They would still compete in foreign investment markets, technology markets, capital markets, and currency markets. And they would likely carry out a global contest for hearts and minds, with Washington stressing the importance of democracy, open economies, and human rights, and Beijing highlighting its approach, usually known as the China development model. While the great strength of managed strategic competition is an agreed framework, is that it also accommodates continued international collaboration between the two countries when it is in their interests to do so. This would not be possible if we were already in the depths of a new Cold War. In fact, the bilateral framework, which continues to actively embrace defined areas of cooperation, may well be the best means of arresting or perhaps preventing the full and formal slide into a Cold War. There are many, however, who would criticise such an approach as naive. Why, they ask, should their country tie its hands by accepting any limits in such an important strategic contest? Many in Beijing might question, for example, why Beijing should in any way tie its hands in its approach to questions of territorial integrity and national sovereignty in places like the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or for that matter in cyberspace or outer space. Meanwhile, American military strategists, like their Chinese counterparts, will not want their hands tied unnecessarily by what they would see as foreign policy abstractions that would get in the way of the hard business of military preparedness, naval exercises and war plans. And the Pentagon and politicians on Capitol Hill could well argue that managed strategic competition would allow China to continue strengthening its economy and its technological capabilities in the absence of any imminent threat, enabling Beijing to continue expanding its military capabilities over the same period and placing it in an even more advantageous position by the end of the decade. But there are deeply realist answers to these various objections. From an American perspective, having another decade to rebuild, or in some cases deepen, US economic, military and technological power, with some prospect of improving the balance of power in relation to China in each of these domains, is no small thing. In this sense, time could be argued to be America's friend, not its enemy, despite the fact that the Chinese might, of course, argue the same from their own perspective, as they too seek to enhance their strategic, military and economic position in the immediate years ahead. From both perspectives, the critical question could become one of whether you believe you would be in a better position to deter a military challenge based on your current military capabilities, or one based on the enhanced capabilities you would have in a decade's time. Furthermore, if deterrence then failed, whether you would prefer to fight with your existing warfighting capabilities or wait for an expanded capacity in the future. The truth, as both sides know, is that the uncertainty of the outcome of any such conflict is too great. The sheer destructive force of such a conflagration is beyond imagining. I'm always reminded of the opening lines of Sun Tzu's Bing Fa, which reminds us that war is a great matter of state, not to be undertaken lightly, because if you lose the war, you lose the state. Now that text has now been studied across the world. And while some uber hawks in both capitals may contemplate seeking to resolve the underlying political confrontation in the US-China relationship through a more immediate, limited war, as a demonstration of strength and resolve, I believe this to be a fool's errand. History tends not to believe in limited wars. History tells us instead that wars are far more likely to escalate uncontrollably. Indeed, this thinking was part of the national psychologies at play prior to the outbreak of World War I, and we all know where that ended. Meanwhile, the bottom line is that a mutually agreed framework of managed strategic competition offers some potential to reduce the temperature levels in the most highly volatile theatres of operation, where at present there are very few, if any, rules of the road to prevent even unintentional crises and escalation. Absent any such guardrails for the future, the frequency and intensity of naval and air operations means that it is less and less a question of if Beijing and Washington will have to handle the operational consequences of an unintended collision between Chinese, American or other military vessels or aircraft in the future, but rather when they will have to handle it. For these reasons alone, there is an overwhelming case to take all necessary precautionary measures now to significantly reduce the risk of war. And that is where managed strategic competition comes in. So what would be the argument in favour of managed strategic competition as seen from Washington? In the United States, the principal benefit from an extended period of managed strategic competition would lie in the economic dimensions of its relationship with China. The engine of America's global power remains its economy, its size, its innovation, its efficiency, its competitiveness, its influence on international standard setting, its impact on global trade and investment, the depth of its capital markets, and the continuing global status of the United States dollar. None of these historical economic strengths are set in concrete, as our Chinese friends well know, and all are now being challenged, as our Chinese friends all know. All need to be addressed, in the United States case, with reform. An ability to contain the underlying security red lines in the relationship with Beijing within reasonable, manageable and stable strategic guardrails would enable the United States to focus on the longer-term fundamentals of American national economic power. The reality is that America needs time to do this. Indeed, for America to succeed with an effective national strategy, it will also need sufficient buy-in from both sides of American politics, so that the 2020s become a decade of rebuilding American power, no matter which party holds political power. This will require unprecedented bipartisan consensus to guarantee strategic continuity across administrations, rather than one that is truncated every time there is a change in the White House. And this will not be easy. So what is the argument in favour of strategic competition from China's perspective? I argue that for China the situation is similar to that of the United States. We should never forget that China's underlying interests continue to lie in the long-term growth of its economy. It is the size, sophistication and strength of the Chinese economy that remains fundamental to all other elements of Chinese national power, or 综合国力. For nearly 20 years, successive Chinese leaders defined the current era as, quote, a period of strategic opportunity, 战略机遇期, when the absence of significant international conflict meant that China could focus almost exclusively on its national economic development task, allowing it to fulfill the first centenary goal of achieving a moderately prosperous society, 小康社会. But that era of easy opportunity is now over. In fact, as President Xi Jinping said in his recent speech, China has entered a new era in which the challenges arising from both, and I quote him, the change to the principal contradictions, the 主要的矛盾, in Chinese society and the new issues and challenges stemming from a complicated international environment, unquote, now necessitate what he describes as a new development philosophy and a new pattern of development, as well as national self-reliance in technology, or 自力更生. The reality is that China now finds itself in a more adversarial strategic environment than before. On balance, the Chinese political establishment would of course have preferred to have avoided the new sharp edges of America's post-2017 strategic approach to China. There are several economic drivers underpinning China's position. China has still not passed the United States in aggregate economic size, although in my judgment that is probable in the future. China has not yet escaped the middle income trap, despite such significant progress on eliminating poverty. China remains critically dependent too on the United States for various critical technology inputs, like semiconductors. China is also chronically reliant on a number of American allies for its long-term mineral and energy needs. And China will still be vulnerable to the current US dollar-denominated and dominated international financial system for a large part of the decade ahead. Of course, all these factors are well known in Beijing. Indeed, it may well be the view of some strategic Chinese analysts, therefore, that the recent and rapid deterioration in US-China relations and the associated crises in China's relations with various US allies and partners have perhaps come at least one decade too early. Therefore, there are reasons that China may wish to see some level of restabilization of the US-China relationship that would enable the Chinese leadership to return to its principal focus on the economy. China is sufficiently pragmatic to recognize that returning the relationship to the status quo ante is now simply impossible. Too much has happened in the US-China relationship since the 2018-2019 trade war, the 2020 pandemic, and the increasingly hardwired policy settings of the Biden administration since the start of 2021 to undo much of the last 4 years. But that does not mean that there isn't a pragmatic interest in preventing the relationship from becoming even worse, thereby compounding China's current levels of economic exposure. A framework of managed strategic competition that was able to manage down the growing array of security and foreign policy tensions that currently dominate the relationship with the United States would enable Beijing to focus once again on its long list of continuing structural economic vulnerabilities. Indeed, it could be well argued that if managed strategic competition was able to reduce overall security policy tensions for the decade ahead, it would be less problematic for China to extend its foreign policy influence, particularly if other countries no longer felt an acute binary decision in their overall relationships with Washington and Beijing on fundamental national security questions. And in fact, if Chinese foreign policy returned to being the handmaiden of its successful economic policy that we have seen over the last several decades, then China's net political position in the eyes of the world would probably be enhanced. And under those circumstances, China's more recent 战狼外交 could 休息一下. This would not preclude China, if it so chose, from continuing to wage its own ideological contest against the United States and the West and the rest of the democratic world by defending and championing its own China development model in opposition to the Washington consensus model. If China is convinced of the superiority of its own system, and as President Xi Jinping said recently, that China has pioneered a new and uniquely Chinese path to modernization and created a new model for human advancement, unquote, and that this was, quote, attributable to the fact that Marxism works, unquote, then China should be encouraged to advocate that system. That would be China's opportunity. Indeed, ideological and ideational competition in many respects would inevitably lie at the heart of a concept of a managed strategic competition framework. It is only natural that both sides should have self-confidence, 自信, that their model is up to the task. As I've argued elsewhere in the world of ideas, systems and governance, may the best side win. But a managed strategic competition framework would also provide important scope for continued Chinese cooperation with the United States in defined and agreed areas. There are a number of policy domains where China, for the decade ahead, would see its own national interests served by working collaboratively with the United States. This includes the maintenance of global financial stability through the G20, the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, the International Monetary Fund, where both China and the US are already active members. China has no interest in a repeat of recent international financial crises, as these could potentially derail China's own long-term economic trajectory. Second, on climate change, China's own national economic and environmental interests mandate global cooperation. Although China is the largest global emitter of greenhouse gases, and its national emission reductions targets are critical to global climate outcomes, they will ultimately be ineffective unless this is done in tandem with the US, Europe, Japan, and most critically, India. In other words, on climate, there is no other option for Beijing other than to work with Washington to drive global outcomes. And third, there are ongoing risks of global nuclear proliferation. Iran and North Korea represent the greatest dangers on this account. While neither country is ever likely to target China, Beijing does have an interest in preventing retaliatory proliferation by other states, for example by Japan, seeking to maintain their own security against future nuclear threats from either Tehran or Pyongyang. Once again, there is a Chinese national interest at stake in collaborating with the United States in maintaining the integrity of the existing multilateral non-proliferation regime. For all these reasons, managed strategic competition may offer China an alternative strategic framework to govern its overall relationship with the United States for the decade ahead. Both China and the United States are currently in search of a new organizing principle for the relationship, given the post-2017 US strategic reality that China now confronts. There is no possibility of returning to a simpler era of the successive US administrations called strategic engagement. There has already been far too much water under the bridge for that. The critical question for Beijing is whether there is sufficient leeway to work with a concept of managed strategic competition from the perspective of China's own national interests, China's values and China's strategy to justify the security policy constraints that such a framework could impose. I do not know the answer to that question, but it's certainly a question worth asking. To conclude, safeguarding the path to a new future. The question for the future for all of us is, how do we provide peace for the decade ahead? The underpinning logic of this concept of managed strategic competition may appear to some to be contradictory, in that such a mutually agreed framework provides both China and the United States with an opportunity to advance their respective regional and global objectives. But that is the essential point. Rather than pretend that is not the reality, it acknowledges that that is the reality. For such a framework to be effective in reducing the risk of armed conflict in the midst of high-octane competition between the two countries, it must have some chance of being accepted or at least recognised in both capitals. Otherwise, it would simply be little more than the sound of one hand clapping and of limited strategic use in stabilising the relationship. Therefore, to achieve its central purpose, managed strategic competition must offer a balanced framework. It cannot be loaded entirely in one direction or the other. Were that to be the case, there would be no chance of it ever being adopted or acknowledged as a common approach. It would then simply be yet another unilateral formula with very few, if any, common rules of the road remaining. As for the particular joint framework offered here, Chinese critics will argue that it may be too weighted in favour of American interests, most particularly on one of its critical assumptions concerning the desirability of maintaining the status quo over the Taiwan situation. This, of course, is anathema to fundamental Chinese articles of faith. But the strategic reality is that to do other than that, other than to maintain stability over Taiwan, would automatically trigger equally fundamental American objections. On the other hand, a number of American critics will argue the proposed formula is naive because it assumes that China would automatically adhere to the rules once they were agreed, and the same American critics will argue that China can no longer be trusted. However, the equal strategic reality here is that there is little that has been recommended under this framework that cannot readily be subject to monitoring and verification. Trust, therefore, is not a prerequisite. The critical logic of managed strategic competition is to allow maximum competition across the full breadth of the foreign policy, economic and security relationship, while doing this within fixed political guardrails that minimise the risks of crisis, conflict and war. Therefore, to conclude, for the terms of such a framework to be mutually acceptable and enforceable, each side would need to have some level of confidence that they could still effectively compete within it. Of course, their individual capacities to advance their interests through competition and within the agreed parameters of managed strategic competition would depend entirely on the effectiveness of their policies, a combination of economic success, political resilience, diplomatic skill, technological advancement, as well as the robustness and global appeal of their competing ideational frameworks that each side puts forward. This approach is far from perfect, but for those who disagree with me, and there will be many, here is my challenge. Please come up with something better. I haven't seen anything yet. The reality is that in this new age of strategic competition between China and the United States, as a matter of logic, there are only two alternatives. Managed strategic competition with some rules of the road and some prospect of preserving peace, or unmanaged competition, the loss of all strategic guardrails and the growing risk of crisis, conflict or war. Some nationalists on both sides might argue that all this does is kick the can down the road. There is truth in this, but that does not make it wrong to do so. I would argue that there is nothing wrong, let alone cowardly, with kicking this particular can as far down the road as we can. What managed strategic competition would do in the end is leave open another possibility, that over time, if such a framework delivers the strategic stability that is being sought, new levels of trust may re-emerge in the longer term, even amid competition, and that in time it may well come to pass that new ways of thinking, new silhouette about each other develop between China and America and their peoples. Common global challenges like climate change and pandemics may assume a greater importance for all governments out there. As generations change and more classical forms of interstate rivalry begin to subside within our overall political priorities. But for that to happen, we must first get through the current generation and the decade ahead. When it comes to reassessing international order in today's new era, finding a strategic framework for the US-China relationship for the decade ahead is the place where we must begin to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kevin Roth, for your keynote speech. You work at a very well-known American think tank, as a very well-known Australian leader. you have profound insights on managing U.S.-China relations. I think your speech is very profound. I'm sure there are many questions, but because of time limit, I would allow only one question from the floor. What about, there are many hands up in the air, but today I have been favoring the right hand, and I gave opportunities to gentlemen. So now I'd like to give the opportunity to a lady. Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Kevin Rudd for your speech and for sharing your thoughts. You spoke of the problems in China-US relations. I'd like to ask a question about China-Australia relations. You spoke of the growing tension in China-US relations, but as far as I'm concerned, I think China-Australia relations has deteriorated, especially in terms of foreign policy and trade, since last year. You spoke of the hope of being a critical friend of China, and you are friendly toward China. How do you see the recent deterioration of China-Australia relations? What do you think are the reasons behind, and what is the direction you want this relationship to move in? I'm from CCTV, thank you.
Thank you for the question. 谢谢您提出的问题呢。There are two elements to the Australia-China relationship. The first is the complexity in the relationship at present arises in part because of the long-standing Australian military alliance with the United States. And therefore, when we speak about the future of the US-China relationship and finding a new strategic equilibrium in that relationship, the speech I gave today, I'm also doing so because that is important in terms of assisting and providing a new opportunity for equilibrium in the Australia-China relationship, and in the Japan-China relationship, and in the ROK-China relationship, and in the Western Europe-China relationship, for example, all of which are military allies of the United States. So therefore, when I spoke before about the idea or the concept of managed strategic competition, I am not simply talking about the interests of the two countries, although that is central. I'm talking about the importance of it becoming a stabilising factor for third countries, including my own country, Australia. The second element of the relationship, of course, is local to the Australian government and the Chinese government, and have to do with a range of bilateral frictions, bilateral problems, and difficulties, both in what has been done and what has been said, and frankly, the difficulties which still exist. For the future of the Australia-China relationship, I would strongly suggest, in the case of the bilateral relationship, that it would be good if both Canberra and Beijing could now push the pause button, and that is to simply take stock for a period ahead. As I say constantly in the Australian debate, to my Australian political colleagues, and frankly many of my opponents, it's far better that they do more and speak less about the difficulties currently in the Australia-China relationship. Mind you, I could also say that in terms of some of China's most recent Zhanlan Waijiao as well, when, for example, the Global Times once wrote, not that long ago, that Australia was sometimes like a piece of chewing gum stuck on the shoe of China, which from time to time needs to be peeled off the bottom of the shoe. I think I would regard that, and many of my Chinese friends would regard that as an unfortunate intervention in the debate. So my suggestion to both Canberra and Beijing is, let us push the pause button and let us try and find some breathing space to renormalise this relationship. rather than simply compounding the problems which already exist. Now, thank you so much for your question, and I know I've already run over my allocated time. So back to you, Wang Chao 先生。
好，谢谢陆克文先生。对。
Thank you, Mr. Kevin Rudd. I would like to once again thank you for giving the speech and answering the question. And I would like to thank all three keynote speakers, Mr. Fukuda, Mr. Pan, and Mr. Kevin Rudd, for your excellent keynote speeches and for answering and interacting with the audience. We have benefited much from the discussion. This year marks the 50th anniversary of China's return to the UN. China was among the first to propose the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and later we proposed the building of a harmonious and a peaceful world, and now we are working for the building of a community of shared future. So all along, China has been contributing Chinese wisdom to the world. This year also marks the 100th anniversary of the CPC. 3 days ago, we celebrated the centenary. President Xi Jinping spoke at a rally the importance of peace, harmony, and concord. These are the values the Chinese nation has been upholding for 5,000 years. We have no gene in our blood to conquer others, to establish hegemony. The CPC has a vested interest in a peaceful world, and we would like to work with all the peace-loving progressive forces in the world to uphold peace, to build prosperity, and to uphold international order. China will continue to be committed to peace, development, and prosperity. We will continue to pursue an independent foreign policy of peace. We will stick to our path of peaceful development, and we will build new type of international relationship, build a community of shared future, and continue to build the BRI and contribute to the world through our own development. China will continue to work with all peace-loving countries and the people in the world to promote peace, justice, and democracy. These are the values shared by humanity. We favor cooperation. We are opposed to confrontation. We are in favor of openness. We are opposed to isolation. We would like to advance the vehicle of history toward a bright future. So I think I have fulfilled my duty as the moderator of this plenary session once again. I would like to thank all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Wang Chao for the opening ceremony. We will now transfer to Liaoning International Hotel for a buffet lunch and resume to our first plenary at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Cool.